said, long ago there lived a king named Midas. And Midas was a rich king. Every evening, King Midas would count his gold. And even though he had plenty of it, he always wished he had more. Well, one evening, his wish came true. Magically, a genie of some sort appeared to him and said, everything you touch after morning's light will turn to gold. And so, very excited, hardly could sleep at all, he waited for dawn to break. And when the first light came, he tested it out and he touched the chair. And sure enough, that chair turned to gold. And he was thrilled. And so he began going through the house, touching different things, and turning them to gold. And he thought to himself, how magnificent this is. I will be more rich than anyone else in the kingdom. I'll be able to provide for my kingdom from generations to generations. My power will be great, and so will my name. But in all the excitement, he began to realize that he was hungry and thirsty. And so he called for a glass of juice. And they brought the juice, the servants brought the juice to him, and he grabbed the juice and went to drink it, but it immediately turned to gold. And then he set that down and grabbed an apple, but before he could get it to his mouth, it too turned to gold. And just as he was pondering what to do about this situation, his thoughts were interrupted with a noise at the door, and like a bolt of lightning, in rushed his 6-year-old daughter with a flower in her hand, saying, Daddy, Daddy, look at my flower. And before he could respond, she leaps to his arms, and instinctively his hands go out to grab her. And as soon as they touched his daughter, she too turned to pure gold. What he thought was the greatest gift imaginable suddenly became the worst curse that he could have ever thought. Our money can be simple, can it? In lots of ways, it can be such a blessing to us, has the capacity to be a blessing, and we often think of it as a great gift. But it can also, at the same time, wreak havoc on our lives and take us in directions that we never intended to go. So how do we handle such a powerful gift? Well, that's the question that we're trying to answer in this series called How to Be Rich. Because many of us, if not all of us, are rich. But do we know how to be rich? If you're just joining us this week, we're in our third week of this series. The first two weeks of messages are on video. They are on our website now. We're grateful for all the work that has gone into putting them up there. So if you want to catch up with us, the sermon outlines are on there for download as well. And just get an idea of where we've been, because we've got one more week following next week. But we're in our third week of this series, How to Be Rich. And our goal is not that we would feel guilty, that you would feel guilty for being rich, but that you would feel responsible for being rich. Responsible with the riches that you've been given. And most often, we don't talk about our money. We don't talk about things that have to do with money because they tend to be kind of private. And frankly, I don't like to talk about it too much in church, and I confessed our first week that I haven't talked enough about it. Because when you compare how much I've talked about it and how much we talk about it to the amount that Jesus talked about it, we fall way short. Jesus talked about it a lot. Why? Because our treasures are connected to our hearts. And Jesus cares about our hearts. He said, where your treasure is, there will be your heart also. They're connected. So we talked about it a lot. So we're trying to talk about it as well, get a handle on how to be rich. The last time we talked together in this series, we talked about how our hope can be transferred. Our hope tends to transfer from the one who richly provides, from God who gives us everything. We tend to transfer our hope into our wealth because we tend to see that our wealth provides for our needs. If we have a need, money seems to be providing that. But when we just see that with our physical eyes, our hope gets transferred to our wealth, and we misunderstand that God is the one that has provided that in the first place. So how do we resist that temptation to transfer our hope to our wealth? How do we stop that migration of our hope or our transfer? Well, Paul's going to give us the answer to that question in the verse that we're going to look at today. But let's first review what Paul specifically says to this group of people called the rich. He's talking specifically to a group of people. He's telling Timothy, tell the rich this. And this is what he says to him in verse 17 of chapter 6, 1 Timothy. He says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant. Paul knew that the temptation would be to be arrogant. Those who have wealth would tend to be arrogant. He probably knew this by the people around him, but we also know that at a time in Paul's life, he too was rich. If you recall in Philippians, that popular verse that we use in chapter 4, he says, I know what it is to be in plenty. That means he was rich. But he also knew what it was to be in want. And he says, I've learned the secret to being content no matter what those circumstances are. What's the secret? I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. So he understood the temptation to be arrogant when you have a certain amount of wealth. So he says, command those who are rich not to be arrogant, because that's going to be the tendency. Nor, and here's where the transfer of hope comes, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. And the last time we were together, we declared that we made that declaration together, I will not put my hope in riches. Like riches, who would put their hope in riches? They're so uncertain. Stock market can crash, our moth and rust and thieves can come and destroy. Why would we put our hope in riches when we can put our hope in the one who richly provides? So he's saying, don't put your hope in wealth, that's so uncertain, but put their hope in God who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. God wants us to enjoy. It's not a guilt trip. There's a level of joy that he wants us to have with that wealth. But we've got to watch out for some of these things that would tempt us to transfer our hope. So now here is what Paul says, how to avoid transferring your hope from God who richly provides to your wealth. Here's what he says, verse 18. Command them to do good. Still talking about the rich. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. So we're just going to break this apart here today. He says, command them to do good, but not just good, not just average good. Everybody's supposed to be good. Anybody, all human beings are supposed to be good. He's saying, be good-er. Be more good. He's got it. Do more good. And he uses this sort of play on words, right? You see, tell those who are rich. He's saying, be rich like you are in wealth. Be rich in your good deeds. Do more with your wealth. He's not saying that you'll earn favor with God or that you're going to somehow earn brownie points for doing this good. But doing good with your wealth will help you keep your wealth, will help you keep your hope from being transferred to your wealth. By doing good with it, that's going to stop that or help that temptation from moving your hope from the one who provides to the actual provision. It gets you thinking outside of yourself. it changes the way you think. One who is rich is to do more good. I know I keep saying gooder and it just bugs you all, but that's the intent. It's to bug you, keep your attention. Rich is to do gooder. I know it bothers my mom the most, so that's why. Gooder, because there is more opportunity to do so. Does anybody know the name Tom Monahan? Anybody recognize that name, Tom Monahan? Detroit Tiger fans? No? How about, okay, Mark?
Was he a receiver?
What's that?
Was he a receiver?
No, he wasn't. Anybody know Domino's Pizza? Domino's, oh, I see that hand back there. Well, if you've ever had a pizza delivered to your house, whether it's Domino's or otherwise, you can probably thank Tom Monahan. Because in the 60s, he started this business. It originally was Dominic's, now we know it as Domino's. But he sparked that. His niche was getting pizzas from their ovens to your door, and you didn't have to go anywhere. Pizza delivery. Well, that business obviously boomed, right? And that business grew into a huge franchise. And he was also owner of the Detroit Tigers for a while, and I think they won at least one World Series while he was owner of that. But anyway, he was living large. You can imagine he had all the money and more that he could ever think of, and he's living large until one day he reads a passage out of C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, and it hits him right between the eyes. And his life takes a 180-degree turn. And instead of living large and lavishly, he shifted his thoughts and began to give away that wealth. He sold Domino's Pizza for around $1 billion in 1998, and has been giving money away and changing the way his life changed because he began to think differently. And I'm not hailing him as some great hero. What I'm saying is that something got his attention to shift his thinking about his wealth, and it changed his life. Tom began to think differently about what he had. He thought differently about the extra, because he had plenty of extra to think about. And what Paul is saying here when he's saying do good, be rich in good deeds, think differently about your extra. I think every one of us has some extra. If we really gave it some thought to think about what do we need, and really think about what the needs are, not what do I need to maintain the lifestyle that I have. What do I need, and then what do I have left over? And think differently about what to do with that extra than the average person thinks. What do we tend to do with our extra? When we have extra of something, whether it's money or whatever, what do we tend to do with it? When we have extra? When we have plenty of it? We spend it. Not just money, anything. We tend to waste it, right? I mean, we got plenty of it. And the thing that I thought about the most with this concept is water. I mean, we have plenty of water at our house. Whenever we want water for a shower, it comes on in full force. When we want drink water, we can go right to the tap, can flush the toilets, we can brush our teeth. Not with the same water, obviously, but we can do all that with water and we don't even think about it. We have a well that has plenty of water that it can tap from. But it needs one thing to do that: electricity. And when the electricity goes out like it did this week, on Wednesday, suddenly all of what we are used to, right? We have plenty of extra, and we don't realize that we're wasting it. You can turn the faucet on, brush your teeth, and the faucet's running, and you're brushing, you know, and then you grab a whole bunch of it. Well, when you don't have but a few gallons in the bladder tank that's going to still pressurize the system a little bit, you become what? A little more conservative. Don't flush the toilet yet, you know. Or just use a little bit to brush your teeth. We tend to waste our extra. But Paul's saying, think differently about it. Think differently about the extra that you have. Instead of wasting it and risk putting your hope in the wealth, do more good with it. Do more good with your wealth. Now it may seem like a stretch, but it's also seems like the exact thing that Paul is heading towards when he continues this line of thought by adding a couple of qualifiers to this doing more good concept. There's two qualifiers that he adds to it. The first one is, you saw, be generous. Be generous. Who tends to give more? The rich or the poor? Who tends to give more? You're saying the poor. It's kind of sort of a trick question, isn't it? Well, I want to do a myth buster, okay? Because it may not be a myth to you, but I think it's a myth to many of us, or to many in this country, and maybe we've believed it. I certainly have believed it myself, and find myself even believing it when I even don't want to believe it. But the myth is, when I have more, I'll give more. Has anybody ever heard that before? Heard that concept from somebody else? I won't ask you to raise your hand, but have you ever thought that yourself? Well, I'll give more when I have more. You know? Well, that's a myth. And we're going to do Mythbusters, because the truth is, the richer people are, the less they give. The richer people are, the less they give. Unless, of course, they know how to be rich. Unless, of course, they know how to be rich. Paul knew this truth. He knew that rich people tend to give less, and so he is saying, be generous. Be generous. Be willing to distribute, willing to give, because your tendency is going to be to give less, or wait until you have some more to give. So he's saying be generous. It's the only way to counter that natural tendency. Counter that natural tendency by doing the opposite. Be generous. I'm not sure you believe me, so let me just pull up a chart here and try to convince you. It's not the best chart but it's the best one that I could find. That gives us gives you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about. I don't know if you can make out the numbers there. And this was in 2000, and the statistics have changed, but I just couldn't find a chart that was simple enough to help you understand this. But those who make less than $20,000 on the far left of the screen there gave $458, which is 4.6%. That's the donation, and I think that must be on a certain weekly basis or whatever. But then it kind of slopes down from there. You can see more than 100 kind of jumps back up, but the 75 to 100,000 range, maybe that one and the one to the left of it, or a little bit more what we're used to, is half of that. So when you ask the question, and the more recent statistics are that even that 100,000 range, that has changed by about 3%. They're giving 3% less than what they were giving even a few years ago, like this was in 15 years ago in 2000. So who gives more? Well, in one way, you could say that the rich give more because there's more dollars there. But think about it a little bit. What you know of God, do you think He is impressed by numbers of dollars? Do you think He is moved by the numbers of zeros behind a certain digit, whether it's 5 figures or 6 figures? Do you think he's moved by that? God is moved by percentages. God's moved by percentage. Now, well, how do I know that? Well, I know that by experience, but I also know that because my teacher told me. The master teacher, Jesus, the guy who I claim to follow and every Christian who calls himself a Christian claims to follow, he taught us that percentages matter to God. That's what moves God's heart. And one day he was with his students, we call them disciples, and there came this great teachable moment. So he says to his disciples, come here, gather around, okay? And they're across the way of where the treasury gets deposited, or where the treasures get deposited in the treasury in the temple. And so they're sitting across around that way, and he's like, come here, I want you to see this. So he pulls his disciples in, and he says, look what happens. Just watch the treasury. Watch people putting their money into the treasury. And so they're watching, and Scripture tells us, or Jesus tells the story, that these rich were coming by the treasury. The way they did it, it was kind of in front of everybody. We don't do it this way as much now. But they had this collection container, and everybody would kind of file through and give their collection, you know. And so the rich were coming through, and they were giving lots of dollars. You know, 1 Ben Franklin, 2 Ben Franklin, 3 Ben Franklin, 4, 5 Ben Franklin, 6 Ben Franklin, 7 Ben Franklin, more. I just made that up. Isn't that good? 9 Ben Franklin, 10 Ben Franklin, $1,000. Look, they're being rich and they're putting this in there. And then along comes a widow. And she's got 2 copper coins that are the lowest denomination in Palestine in that day. It was worth about, from the calculations, about 6 minutes worth of work for a person's wage, to give you a concept. She's got 2 of those. And she comes up and she drops those in. And Jesus is saying, look, guys, did you see it? Did you see what happened there? And then he says this to them. Jesus said, truly I tell you, this widow, this poor widow, has put, say it with me, more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything. All she had to live on. She put in everything. God's moved. Jesus was moved. And he taught his disciples that God's moved by percentage, not numbers of dollars. We tend to think of more in dollar amounts. God thinks in percentages. And we need to think more like that. So who gave more? The widow did. Because of percentages. So here's the application. Here's the application. A key to being generous. Okay? Next fill. Key to be generous, pre-decide. Because it's not going to happen on accident. You will not be generous on accident. Followers of Jesus need to pre-decide that they're going to be generous. Make a decision beforehand. You'll do good, and you'll do more good and be more generous when you pre-decide how much you will give. Most of the giving that takes place on average in our country does so spontaneously, emotionally driven. You go through the grocery store, and the cashier says, do you want to donate to this cause? And you're like, guy behind you sort of giving you the eye, and the person in front of you gave, and so you just kind of give, you know, or the offering plate's passed at church and you're getting an elbow from the person sitting next to you to put something in, or somebody shows up your door selling something and you just kind of feel like you're supposed to do that. A lot of the giving is just spontaneous and emotionally driven, which isn't necessarily bad, but that should be on top of what was already previously decided. So I don't know if these statistics are right, but I think it's probably a little bit high, but the average income for average income American gives about 6%. I think that's high, but that's the statistic that I heard. But they do that by accident. They do that, that's just what it ends up being. At the end of the year, come tax time, that's about what it ends up being. So if you have it pre-decided what percent to give, why not start at least where people of average income in America start by accident? Why not start there? And I would just encourage you to increase that as quickly as you can, up to 10%. Now, I'm not saying that that is the Christian thing to do. I think it has a strong biblical base, and from personal experience, I think 10% is a great standard for us that follow Jesus, is to give 10% right off the top. I think that's the best place to be, so I encourage you to at least start at the 6% and work your way up as you think about the percentages and pre-deciding what you will give. People who know how to be rich pre-decide and think about their wealth in percentages. Another way to think about generosity is that it's not the size of the gift, but it's the size of the sacrifice made. It's not the size of the gift that matters as much as the size of the sacrifice. Think about God as a giver. God's a giver, right? God gives out of His love for us. Is God a reluctant giver or a generous one? He's a generous giver. John 3:16 is a verse that we all know. Say it with me. For God so loved the world that He gave. Stop right there just a second. He so loved the world that He gave. Now think. We know what He gave. Can you imagine any greater gift in our circumstances than what God gave? Can you imagine any greater sacrifice that God could have made than to give His Son so that you and I could regain that fellowship as creation to our Creator? I would guess that you couldn't think of a greater gift or a greater sacrifice that could be made. Because He gave us His Son so that when we believe in Him, we could have life. God is a generous giver. So be generous is that first qualifier of doing more good. The second qualifier that Paul gives, besides being generous, is to be willing to share. Now this was a very interesting discovery for me. Very interesting. And maybe you've thought of this already, but for me it was new and exciting. What comes to mind when it says be willing to share? What comes to mind when you hear that word share? Like when you think about that, okay, be willing to share. What does that mean to you? What do you think about? Can you give an example? Be willing to share. What comes to your mind? You can't have a wrong answer here. It's not a trick question like the first one.
Share food.
To share food, okay? If you're going to share food, how would you, maybe could I press a little bit, how would you share food?
Good question.
Okay.
Bring your peppers and set out here by the mailboxes and
give them out as people are leaving.
Okay, so are you sharing or are you giving?
Well, you're sharing what you produce
Okay.
and giving it away.
Right, right. Are you starting to get the distinction that I'm teasing out here, Tim? You think of time, sharing time, okay? Do you have a specific thing that you're thinking of?
Time, you can't give your time to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
You still have it.
Right.
So share is by definition. You can't say I'm only going to have 20 hours today.
Right.
I'm donating 4 to the children's orphanage.
We talk about giving time, but time really stays with us and you share.
Yeah, you can personally go to the children's orphanage.
Right.
And engage at some level with them, and they benefit from that 4 hours, and you benefit from that 4 hours. But you
Yes.
can't just write a check and send
That's
it.
right. Right. You're getting exactly where I'm talking about. That word share. How many of you thought of little kids when you talk about sharing? Right? Let's just imagine 2 little boys, okay? Billy comes over to Johnny's house, and I'm sorry if your name's Billy or Johnny here. Billy comes over to Johnny's house, and they're playing in the toy room, and Mom hears in the next room a scream, and Johnny yell, "Mine!" And she walks into the room, and Johnny's got a death grip on his truck. This is a pretty cool truck. Johnny's got a death grip on the toy, on the truck. He's mine, right? You don't have to teach a kid to do that. They do that naturally. Mine. And then Mama says, "Johnny, you need to share." Now, do you expect, or what you hope for as a parent, father, mother, or as an aunt or an uncle or caregiver to that child that you're saying, "Now Johnny, share." Do you expect Johnny, or do you hope that Johnny says, "Oh, you can have my truck, I'll go do something else"? I mean, that would be better than, "Here, take it, and go." Like that, right? I mean, that's a little better. But do you really hope that Johnny gives the truck away, that he would no longer have that? No, what you're hoping for is that Johnny and Billy can share access to this truck and enjoy fellowship with one another. Isn't that right? That's what you hope for. And what Paul is getting at in trying to help us not be so tempted to transfer our hope from God to our wealth is he's saying, be generous, but be willing to share. Because the more literal translation, and I would guess if you have your Bible open, whether you're on a device or whatever, most translations say be willing to share, and that's fine. But I just think we get a little bit skewed on our thoughts of sharing. The more literal translations, like the King James Version and the American Standard Version, they say be willing to communicate. And when I read that, I thought, what does that mean? What does it really mean to share? But that word is the Greek word koinonos, which we've heard that word koinonia. Right? Koinonia is the fellowship that believers have in Christ. And that is exactly what he's saying. Be willing to share, be willing to be in relationship with the one that needs what you're sharing. Be in partnership or fellowship. Share is in having relationship. Isn't that what you want Johnny and Billy to have? Not to go their separate ways, but you want Billy and Johnny to have the relationship and share access to that truck and enjoy the truck. Both of them equally. Both of them equally can enjoy that. But now let's think about what happens as people gain wealth. Think about stuff first. The rich tend to own all their stuff. They own all their own stuff that they need for daily living. Everybody has their own telephone. Didn't it used to be like there was a telephone for the community? You know? And when televisions came out, not everybody had one in their house, but now everyone has one in their room. Now everyone has a telephone in their pocket, practically. So as wealth and possessions, we're talking about stuff, everybody has their own telephone, everybody has their own entertainment, everybody has their own food storage, their own cooking gear, their own transportation, all in their own home. In a gated community, in a subdivision, in a fenced-in yard, right? You see what I'm getting at? Is that we own all of our own stuff, and we lose the element of sharing, real true sharing with one another. Now, I wish we had more time, but I'd like to spend probably about a half an hour taking the pros and cons of sharing. Sharing with this concept that actually enjoying and sharing equal access to what we have. Now, it's not as foreign to some of the older ones who were used to living in that community as it is to some of us younger used to having everything for ourselves. Maybe that's a good exercise that you would enjoy doing sometimes. Pros and cons of actually sharing. Because there are some difficulties. When you share something like that, and you have to be in relationship. Now, you all know that communication is not the easiest thing. Right? But he's saying be willing to communicate, and that's how relationships function. That's the oxygen of relationships, is communication. So that's the first thing. When we think about their stuff, as rich people tend to gain, or as people tend to gain wealth, they tend to get their own things and share less. Because I want my own whatever. I want to take responsibility for it, and I don't want anybody else to break it, or whatever. Okay, so I'll get off that. The second thing to think about is, who do rich people tend to associate with? People very similar to themselves. In social clubs, golf, or whatever it is that they're a part of, they tend to associate with people very similar to themselves, plus or minus in an income. Wealth, then, can naturally become a barrier to connecting with people of a different financial status than you. It can just naturally build this bubble around us. I don't know about you, but I've often felt like I just live in this bubble in a lot of ways. And wealth can do that. It can naturally just provide this barrier between us and people who are different than us with their financial status. People they tend to eat with, people they tend to recreate with, people they tend to work with, all have the same problems, and usually they're rich people problems. And so you begin to think inside this bubble, well, the people that I associate with, the people that I usually hang out with, they're fairly well off and they're kind of okay, and I look around me and poverty's not such a big deal. What are they talking about? You know, what's the you know, everybody I know has enough. And so this bubble is there. So the rich tend to become insulated from poverty by those owning their own stuff and living sort of in this bubble. And Paul is saying to the rich, be willing to communicate, be willing to associate with those who are in need, be willing to be in partnership or fellowship, that koinonia, be willing to share. And he's saying, do not let your wealth isolate you. Do you see how wealth can just isolate us from those with whom we need to share? Don't let your wealth isolate you. Because if you do, your hope is likely going to be transferred. Your hope is going to likely migrate over to your wealth instead of with the one who richly provides. Rich people tend to get themselves in that bubble, but people who know how to be rich carry a little needle in them. And they're ready to pop that bubble whenever it forms. They're ready to pop that bubble and break out of that bubble and are willing to share, willing to associate, willing to fellowship, really fellowship and relationship with. Not just give money, or give time, although it's harder to give time for us because with our time, we actually most often have to be in relationship. So they pop that bubble because they know how to be rich. Long ago, there was another king, a real king this time. A king whose name was Solomon. And Solomon, like King Midas, had the opportunity for one wish to be granted. God told Solomon, as king, ask for anything that you would want, and I'll give it to you. Solomon could have asked for more riches. He could have asked for a bigger kingdom. He could have asked for anything. But what did Solomon ask for? He asked for wisdom, so he would know how to be rich. Let's pray and ask God for that same thing.